Hi students, this is Leah Hepburn. In front of you right now, you should be seeing an argumentative essay by the fake student Taylor Dunham. And we have here an example of a an argumentative essay. Um, we actually have two examples here that we're going to be comparing and talking about. So this one you haven't seen before, but if you've watched the previous video about MLA citations, this essay by the fake student Teal Pfeiffer, you've seen before. So over here, if you recall, we went over in-text citations and how they correspond to the works cited page. But today we're going to be focusing on overall structure of an argumentative essay. So these two essays demonstrate two types of argument structure. So this first one, this Taylor Dunham essay, is pretty typical and uh, the most like an essay that you've seen or that you've written before in this class. So here we have MLA heading, MLA header, MLA heading, and the title here is An Argument Against the Anna Todd Jennings Scholarship. So right away, we not only have a side, so we have a topic that has two sides to it, but we know exactly where Taylor Dunham stands in this essay. We know her position about this scholarship. All right, so her introduction here is actually a summary of the controversy. She kind of assumes that her reader doesn't necessarily know everything about this Anna Todd Jennings scholarship, and indeed most of us do not know anything about it. So she gives us a summary of the controversy. So she says, recently a dispute has arisen over the Caucasian restricted Anna Todd Jennings scholarship. Anna Jennings died in 1955, and her will established a trust that granted a scholarship of up to $15,000 for a deserving student. Unfortunately, Jennings, who had certain racist views, limited her scholarship to Caucasian students. After much debate with family and friends, I, a white, well-qualified, and definitely deserving student, have decided not to apply for the scholarship. So this is giving the reader an overview, right? We have a little bit of the biography of Anna Jennings, talking about her death and her will. We say what the scholarship, the amount that it's for, and the controversy is that it's restricted to white students only. We also have this personal addition here that this student is white and also not applying for it. The reason that it's okay for the student to use the first person here, this personal sentence, is because this argumentative essay topic is specific to whatever school that she's attending. And because it's specific to her community, her individual community, and it affects her, it's appropriate that she then uses the first person on occasion. Notice, though, as we go through this, that not much of it is actually in the first person. It's only a couple different places that we see this. At the end of her introduction, just like a normal essay, we have a thesis statement. So the thesis statement says, "It is my view that despite arguments to the contrary, applying for the Anna Todd Jennings Scholarship furthers the racist ideas held by its founder." All right, so based on this thesis statement, here's my expectations for reading this essay. Firstly, I expect to read an essay that argues against applying for the Anna Todd Scholarship. So in other words, I expect a few different ideas or concepts that explain why it's a bad idea. Secondly, I also expect to hear arguments to the contrary. In other words, opposing arguments. The reason I expect that is because of this part right here. Despite arguments to the contrary. This implies that I will definitely hear arguments against the writer's view. In other words, arguments for applying for the scholarship. Although I expect to hear arguments arguing the opposite, I also expect the writer to refute those counter arguments. So in other words, I expect the writer to use the opposing view in order to further her own argument that we should not apply for this scholarship. So let's take a look if my expectations are actually met here. So here we have the first argument. This first paragraph is argument number 1. It says, most people would agree that racism in any form is an evil that should be opposed. The Anna Todd Jennings Scholarship is a dangerous expression of racism. It explicitly discriminates against African Americans, Asians, Latinos, Native Americans, and others. By providing a scholarship for whites only, Anna Jennings frustrates the aspirations of groups who, until recently, have been virtually kept out of the educational mainstream. On this basis alone, students should refuse to apply and should actively work to encourage the school to challenge the racist provisions of Anna Todd Jennings' will. According to one expert, such challenges have been upheld by the courts. The striking down of a similar clause in the will of the 18th century financier Stephen Girard, which limited admission to white male orphans, is just one example. All right, so here we have the argument. Most people would agree that racism is evil. Because most people would agree that racism is evil, and because the Anna Todd Jennings Scholarship is an expression of racism, therefore, students should refuse to apply. Okay, so we have this logical argument against applying for it. Racism is evil. The scholarship expresses racism. Here we get a specific example of how it expresses racism. It goes against these groups. It's only for this one group. And then we have here an explanation of how these two ideas are connected and relate back to the thesis. So on this basis alone, students should refuse to apply. And then here we have further explanation that this has happened before. So not only should students refuse to apply, but the school should also be challenging those the provisions of the legal document, the will. And this has happened before, and she gives it an example here. So that's argument number one. So far, I have part of my expectations of the thesis statement have been met. Let's see if it continues. Argument number two here. The school itself must share some blame in this case. Students who applied for the Anna Todd Jennings Scholarship were unaware of its restrictions. The director of the Financial Aid Office has acknowledged that he knew about the racial restrictions, but thought that students should have the right to apply anyway. The materials distributed by the Financial Aid Office also gave no indication that the award was limited to Caucasians. Students were required to fill out forms, submit financial statements, and forward transcripts. In addition to this material, all students were told to attach a recent photograph to their application. Little did the applicants know that the sole purpose of this innocuous little picture was to distinguish whites from non-whites. By keeping secret the scholarship's restrictions, the school has put students in the position of unwittingly endorsing Anna Jennings' racism. Thus, the school and the unsuspecting students have been in collusion with the administrators of the Anna Todd Jennings Trust. So here we're furthering the first argument. So the first argument says it's racist, racism is evil, the scholarship expresses racism, here's how it expresses racism, based on that, students should not apply to this. And here it furthers this by saying that it's not just the students who apply for the scholarship, but it's also the people who are putting the scholarship as an option to those students. So the school and the administrators of the trust, so the people in charge of the money, in other words. So the school is aware of its restrictions. Here we have specific evidence of that. The director of financial aid acknowledged that he knew about the racial restrictions. There's evidence to suggest that the school covered up this Caucasian restricted part of the scholarship on purpose, so withheld that information from the students. So all of this is giving evidence to suggest that we should not be applying for the scholarship. All right, so far, again, we see arguments in favor of the thesis statement, in favor of the position of the writer. Here we have, in this next paragraph, we have a refutation of opposing argument. So in other words, the writer puts forth the opposition, the view of the opposition, and then refutes it, so goes against the opposition. And here we have the question students face is this: what is the best way to deal with the generosity of a racist? A recent edition of the school paper contained several letters saying that students should accept Anna Jennings' scholarship money. One student said, "If we do not take that money and use our education to topple the barriers of prejudice, we are giving the money to those who will use the money in the opposite fashion." This argument, although attractive, is flawed. If an individual accepts a scholarship with racial restrictions, then he or she is actually endorsing the principles behind it. If a student does not want to appear to endorse racism, then he or she should reject the scholarship, even if this action causes hardship or gives adversaries a momentary advantage. To do otherwise is to further the cause of the individual who set up the scholarship. The best way to register a protest is to work to change the requirement for the scholarship, and to encourage others not to apply as long as the racial restrictions exist. So here we have the opposing argument.